Well, thank you very much. And it's kind of a ritual when we do Zooms, isn't it? You have to say, oh, can you all hear my voice? I see a smile from Micah there, and you can all see my screen, I'm assuming. So, yeah, first of all, let me say that Keith Keeley could not join us. He lives in Madison. He has parental duty tonight. He told me it's bedtime, so he's got prior priorities, and I don't blame him one bit. So Keith, if you haven't met Keith, I'm sure you'll have a chance. He's very active in the conservation arena too, and so we'll look forward to another opportunity. Thank you to all of you for inviting me to join you and to talk about the Driftless Reader, which I never get tired of, and I see several familiar names among the roster here. So hello to everybody, and hope you're all staying healthy, safe, and warm here on this chilly February night. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk just a little bit of a little orientation up front, and then a little bit of background about how the book came together. And then I always like to choose a half dozen or so little pieces from the book just to read. And I'm remembering one of our early events with the book, and we were doing this, and we had different members of the audience reading, and a person commented to me, she said, I just love being read to. So maybe on winter nights, it's a deeply human thing to do, is tell stories to one another. We all have done it in cultures all around the world. So let's start with some orientation. Here's the book cover, but let me use that cover slide here. So if you can see my cursor, I'm sitting right about down here, facing the bluff here. This is my home place where I live, and gee, almost every day, especially during the pandemic, I make a ritual of climbing up the top of the bluff behind my place here. And when I do that, I look due south, and on the horizon are the Blue Mountains. Absolutely due south. I checked this out the other night on Google Maps, and I'm guessing it's about 15 miles, straight line south, across the Wisconsin River Valley, and then through basically between Arena and Mazanani and so forth. So Blue Mountains are always literally on my horizon and on my mind all the time. And so I want to start just by thanking all of you for your work over the years in taking care of the Blue Mountains landscape. I'm well familiar with the work over the years and appreciate it as a neighbor. So I am actually going to start. I often have done this, but just by launching it. I'm going to read you something right away. Maybe some of you on this call actually knew Patricia Monahan. She passed away in 2013, if I'm correct. She and her husband, Michael McDermott, again, some of you may know Michael, started the Black Earth Institute just outside Black Earth, so in your own home landscape. Patricia was a wonderful poet and teacher, deeply connected with Driftless landscape, where she spent every spare minute. They were not in Chicago, they were there. So I'm going to just read to you the poem that opens the Driftless Reader that Patricia Monahan published in, actually shortly after she passed away, was published in a book. This is called Getting to Black Earth, and behind you see an early sketch drawing of I'm not sure exactly which valley near Black Earth, but I've always tried to find that. Maybe some of you know. So this is her poem called Getting to Black Earth, and it speaks for itself. Start with ocean. A shallow sea populous with plankton and giant fish that feed on it. Let storms and sunlight flash across the sea. As bodies die, let them drift down to mud. Then let there be light and fire and heaving, rock on rock. Let the sea sink. Let it pour away into other younger seas. Let the land rest, damp, exhausted, rich. Now let ice appear from north and east and west. Let it move south to form an isle of green in the sea of snow. Let this happen over and over and over for 500,000 years. Let low pink quartzite hills hold back the ice. Let lakes appear beyond inland seas with coastlines of blue snow. Let eagles float above the blue and icy waves, fishing. Now, catastrophe. Let water break through ice. Drowning, sleeping bears still in their caves, and wolves and fleeing deer and mice. Let a great pathway open on the land, marking the pathway of the flood. Let creeks and rivers deepen crevices in rock, and gullies form and soften under wind. Let oaks take root, and shagbark, hickory, and elderberry, yarrow, bee balm, clover, big and little blue stem, rattlesnake master, downy gentian, boneset, dogbean, ragweed, and thickets of sumac, blackberry, blackcap, rose. Let black soil deepen over limestone seabed, except where it erupts on crowns of hills. Then, not long ago, let people come. Start with ocean, end with black earth. So that poem opens the section on geology, the first section in Driftless Reader, and it does what poets do for us. It compresses in beautiful words, big stories. Patricia captured a goodly part of the geologic history of the Driftless Area in those words. And so it provides a perfect opening to talk about the Driftless Reader for those who are well familiar with it, as well as those who are first becoming familiar with this landscape. Now this group, all of you who are listening tonight, I don't think I need to do Driftless even 101. All of you are probably well aware and comfortable with the understanding of where and what the Driftless Area is, but I'm going to show you just a few images again to orient ourselves. These are some early, in fact, that map on the left of your screen is the very first map depicting the Driftless Area. And the later one by T.C. Chamberlain, a premier geologist of the 1800s and president of the University of Wisconsin, key figure in the definition and explanation of the Driftless Area. Here's a map that we use in the book, done by Joshua Kuda, who's actually was just a student when he did this map, and it serves as a frontispiece. What this is showing you the degrees of slope in the Driftless. And if you reverse it, you get this image. So it's a wonderfully evocative portrayal of the Driftless landscape, showing you the county boundaries, of course, overlaid on our distinctive valleys and ridge tops of the Driftless. And just so we know where we are, here's, well, we're all virtual, scattered about, but were we together, we'd be down here. And there's me, see, directly due north along the Wisconsin River. Over here, Keith grew up in the Kickapoo River Valley, so he's a son of the Driftless. So how did the book come about? Well, almost organically. I just realized, I guess, one day that I had a lot of books that had bits and pieces of the Driftless story. This is literally my bookshelf. It's just 3 feet to my left right now. New books on it now. But I began to pull together different sources that had references, chapters. Some were all about the Driftless Area. And I realized that there was a lot there. There's more to why I finally kind of started to do this, and has a lot to do with where I did end up living out here, just down from Ferry Bluff. Some of these books and writers are well known, beloved even, and they are writers who are both local as well as regional, and some with national reputations. So you'll recognize some of these names and titles, perhaps. And in fact, turns out that the Driftless Area has hosted some of the best known writers in American literature, and certainly in the field of sort of nature writing and natural sciences. So all of these key figures, Muir, in fact, I sometimes make a point that the Driftless Area maybe is the only landscape in which John Muir, Henry David Thoreau, and Aldo Leopold had a presence. But all of these key figures had written about the Driftless Area, as well as many contemporaries. Again, some of them, these are actually all, let's see, the only person I haven't met here is David Rhodes. We've corresponded, but these are all friends, colleagues, neighbors who have spent time and written about the Driftless Area. So not just historical writing, but contemporary writers, poets, songwriters, historians, scientists. And so we have this wealth of literature that had never been collected before. In addition, we had an amazing body of imagery to draw upon. And from the beginning, we thought about how we could incorporate the images of the Driftless Area. And that is a vast body of work. Again, some very well-known figures like George Catlin for his classic portrayal of Black Hawk here. And more locally known folks like Frank Patel, who worked very closely with August Derleth. That record of imagery goes back, of course, millennia into the native history, the deep native history in the landscape. And I'll pause just for a moment to say that in compiling the Driftless Reader, Keith and I made every effort to make sure that especially the Ho-Chunk Nation, but all our native neighbors and native communities were represented in the book. And so close consultation with colleagues and friends in the Ho-Chunk Nation at every step of the way. And it's one of the things I'm most pleased about how the reader came together. The images for everything from, as you see, rock art and other depictions and native artwork to early maps, the first map showing the portage across the divide between the Great Lakes and Mississippi watersheds. This is oriented actually, instead of north on the top, that's west. So this is showing the Wisconsin River going down to its meeting with the Mississippi, and those massive mountains down there, you know, early mapping portraying the landscape. Again, some well-known artists in our midst. Aaron Bowrod, connected with UW-Madison, with John Stuart Curry and many others. Sketch work out of Mineral Point. Photographers. Wonderful image from along the Mississippi River. Contemporary artists. Anyone who's been to La Crosse knows this scene as you're coming in from the south on the main drag in La Crosse. So we were able to compile a wonderful collection of images from and about the Driftless, and most of them by Driftless artists. This is Dan Hazlitt, a family friend of Keith Keeley's, as it turns out, in the Kickapoo Valley. This wonderful depiction of prairie smoke and our namesake badgers. And I could go on and on about the imagery, but I wanted to use this image to show you the contents as it came together in the Driftless Reader. And I kind of knew that that I was onto something when this table of contents came together. You'll see it's kind of loosely chronological, going from geologic history all the way up actually to the future. And through this historical sequence, however, the time is mixed up. There's contemporary and historical voices in all of these. So we're able to sort of cross-cut the history through these various categories. But again, I knew I was onto something when, if you look at this table of contents, here's the original version on your here. I was literally driving from Sauk City to Madison one day, going into town for something. And between Sauk Prairie and Madison, I just took out a notepad, and this just popped out of my head. And if you look at it, it's actually pretty close to that list. It's pretty much the same table of contents, and that always tells you something. It's when something spontaneously happens Tells you there the magic is working, right? And similarly on the right, this is the inscription in a book by Laura Sherry. She's a poet out of Prairie du Chien, who in 1931 published a little book of poetry. And I fell in love with this little book. We actually have 3 selections from Laura Sherry's Prairie du Chien poetry book. But she only published 300 copies of this book. It was done as kind of a side project, and she numbered every one of those books, inscribed most of them, and so they're very hard to find. There's one copy in the Historical Society, actually, in Madison. But I won't tell the whole long story, but I was with a colleague, actually a International Crane Foundation colleague, who had no idea I was doing this book. And he comes up to me at a social event and says, "Gee, Curt, I just came across this book. I don't know, I think you might enjoy seeing." And by golly, there it was. She had one of the 300 copies of this that had been in his family house for any cleaning out his basement or something. And he gifted me. He bought it for 25 cents in a flea market or something back in the 1960s, he told me. So I knew the pieces were coming together when a copy of Old Prairie du Chien ended up in my hands. So with that, I think I'll take the rest of the time just to read several selections. It's, I was trying to figure out what to read today, and I literally could just open at random the pages in this book, because you become fond of all the people, faces and voices that you get to know when you do a project like this. So let me start with this one. There's a lot of poetry in the book. And I chose this one, first of all, because there again is Blue Mountains on the horizon. This is looking from Ferry Bluff. I'm sure many of you know this vantage point, looking downstream. So August Derleth, probably the most recognized Wisconsin writer in his generation, and had a national following, writing out of Sauk Prairie. He wrote prolifically. He never had a day where he wasn't writing a lot. I went to my friend Jack Holtzeder, some of you may know Jack, longtime lead historian for the state of Wisconsin in many ways. And he said, look for the poetry, he advised me. So I went to the library in Sauk Prairie, actually, and I came up with this, and I will read to you the poem we included of August Derleth's. It's called Old Man Fishing. That's why I included this image. And whenever I read this, I have this image of Derleth in a little skiff out in the middle of the Wisconsin River having a day fishing. So this is actually written in the early 50s, but finally published in 1960. And again, it captures so much of the orientation of the Driftless Area for me. One old man, as all old men before him, sitting at the river's edge, eyes to the west, with the glacier at his back, centuries on the rim, an old cane pole held up against his breast, all Midwest America unfolding here before his rheumy eyes, going past a new downriver. Jonathan Carter in 1766. There are Indians here, Salpies they call themselves. Lahontan, Marquette, Joliet, Red Bird, each leaving here his mark, each his word. Fur traders, voyageurs, pioneers, Captain Marriott, Chief Black Hawk with his braves' own blood and tears. I loved my cornfields, I fought for them. One old man fishing, he could see the Rockies, he could see the far Pacific. He could see past Sauk and Winnebago, the far Sioux, Dakota, Arapaho, the Dominican Jew, the Oglala, Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, Jim Bridger, Kit Carson, the UP Trail, a land full of wildness and bright with endless tomorrows. One old man fishing in water and in time, Crow, cry, and winds ruin our something starting over. And one old man alone divides all time between the here and now and what was yesterday forever. The glacier at his back, Los Alamos on the distant rim, all America going by, and two boys paddling a canoe. Catching any fish, Grandpa? Fish out of water, one bullhead, one pike, four bright sunfish, and out of time, 100 years or more. What must a century measure in the sunbeam? An old man fishing to while away a dream which began how many years ago? He must be 70, 80 perhaps. He could be as old as all America. He could see years pass since it began, with the glacier at his back, and the wilderness before, the wild Wisconsin and the Indian country on the far side. The dreams as long and wide as any gauge of time or any similar measure. Who's to fix its boundaries? The winds talk, the field sparrow's sweet lament, the wheeling hawk. All are older here than 1953. Below them, one old man is young as a sapling tree. He sits musing with the wind in his beard and his eyes half closed, with his hat pushed low to shut out sun so he can see what's going on, a bobbing cork or rippling wave, a Winnebago passing by, or an Nganje, a fragment of a day or year gone by, or just today, canoe, keelboat, steamboat, launch, a raft of logs, an otter flashing past, fur traders, pioneers, time beginning once again, time that was starting over, when the least pebble turned under a red man's heel, when the sand washed back from General Dodge's step, when the stagecoach rode by in ruts gone with the next rain, when the wilderness fell back and the leaves turned, where Bob La Follette passed and time burned on the iron rails. One old man fishing under the sun, hearing the wind and the sound time makes. There's so much wrapped up in that poem, Derleth, in 1953. I'll just leave it at that. These readings pretty much speak for themselves, but again, the ability to place himself in that our vast landscape here. Another image of Blue Mountain. I'm not sure where I took this photo, but you may recognize it. I thought I'd read a little passage from probably one of the very best known descriptions of prairie that ever came out of a European writer. This account, The Incidents of a Journey from Pennsylvania to Wisconsin Territory, 1837, William Rudolph Smith. Often people working in prairie conservation and restoration work will use this image if you're working in southwestern Wisconsin especially. And I'll again just read the passage. Some of you are probably familiar with some of this passage. And it's Smith's description of moving along the military ridge during his time in Wisconsin. So this is from 1837, and he's describing being near Belmont Mound. The view from this mound, as well as from the flat near the summit of the eastern mound, beggars all description. An ocean of prairie surrounds the spectator, whose vision is not limited to less than 30 or 40 miles. This great sea of verdure is interspersed with delightfully varying undulations, like the vast waves of the ocean, and every here and there, sinking in the hollows or creating the swell, appear spots of wood, large groves, extensive ranges of timber, small groups of trees, as if planted by the hand of art for the purpose of ornamenting this naturally splendid scene. Over the extended view in all directions are scattered the incipient farms of the settlers, with their luxuriant crops of wheat and oats, whose yellow sheaves already cut form a beautiful contrast with the waving green of the Indian corn and the smooth dark surface of the potato crop. Throughout the prairie, the most splendid variety of flowers are seen rising above the thickly set grass, which has here and there in large and small patches been mowed for hay, presenting a curious checkered appearance of the table beneath us. The prairie flowers are various in hue: the dark purple Masonic or mineral flower, the tall, bright purple and red feather, the prairie sunflower, the goldenrod, the several small and beautifully variegated flowers interspersed amongst the grass, all render the scene indescribably beautiful. I could go on. He must have been there at the very height of the summer prairie bloom in August or so. I'm not sure. I have to track that down. But that image, and what's really interesting to me in reading that when I reread it for the book, was how he's capturing a moment in transition between the native presence, full presence on the land, and the oncoming European settlers imposing themselves and their farms on that landscape. He captures that moment in transition, literally with prairie and crops interspersed. In 1837, of course, was a key date. The lands to the south of the Wisconsin River, the Ho-Chunk had lost in the Treaty of 1829. The lands north of the Wisconsin River, where I am, were in fact at the same time, 1837, the Treaty of 1837, removing the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. There are many stories. I won't be able to even go through all the ones that I was hoping to read, but I'll read a couple more. And it makes a point about the diversity of our landscape, but also the diversity of our peopling of this landscape. Some of you are familiar with the stories of Cheyenne Valley and Pleasant Ridge, two of the better known African-American settlements in the Driftless area that actually predated the Civil War. So I'm going to read a modern poem by Fabu, who at one point was the poet laureate of Madison. She's still quite active, wonderful poet. And when she learned the story of the settlement at Cheyenne Valley, which is in upper reaches of the Kickapoo watershed, when she learned that story, she produced a little poem called Makaya Revels Camped at a Stream of Water. Makaya Revels being one of the key early members of the Cheyenne Valley community, who migrated in 1854, again, pre-Civil War, as a freed Black settler. And so I'll read the short one. The image on the right, by the way, is from Pleasant Ridge, which is near Lancaster in Grant County. And I just love this image. That cemetery is still there. And in fact, there's been a lot more attention to these stories in the last few years, I've noticed, which I'm pleased to see. So here is Fabu's poem, Makaya Revels Camped at a Stream of Water. In Black settlers in rural Wisconsin, there is a notation that a Black man, Makaya Revels, born in 1800 on the Cherokee Reservation, migrated to Dane County and camped at a stream of water 18 miles north of the village of Madison. Makaya traveled on to buy land elsewhere. There is no record of physical description, light, dark, or medium, what he accomplished or who his parents were. In 1800, a Black man was both an oddity and invisible, but the land welcomed him. The land was cheap, fertile with plenty. There was schooling for children and protection for escaped slaves, so Makaya could rest briefly. Who remembers Makaya Revels, Black settler in the 1800s who camped at a refreshing stream 18 miles north of the village of Madison, but moved on, maybe knowing there would be no welcome in Madison? Who remembers that Black people came to Wisconsin to be free? So there are treasures to be had, and this kind of deep dive into the literature of the place. And all along in collecting these together, there was such it was such fun. It's a lot of work, but it was so much fun to constantly find new things that would speak to chapters in the history of the landscape that I was unaware of. A couple more, maybe. This is Chauncey Cook. Since we're on this theme, this follows directly after Fabu's poem in the book, actually. And it's been on my mind. This reading in this writer I fell in love with as I was reading his work. Chauncey Cook was only 16 years when he joined the 25th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry to go into the Civil War. He was actually lied about his age. He was from up in the northwest part of the Driftless area. And he wrote some just incredibly evocative letters home to his parents up there, his family. So I will read just a little bit from several letters from 1862. And what's key here is that Cook was not sent directly to the South. He would later join the battles in the South in the Civil War. But first he was sent to Minnesota because, in fact, this was the time of the so-called Sioux Uprising, a difficult episode in the history of the Lakota. And this is, again, a 16-year-old boy writing to his parents after he had been mustered out and had joined his regiment. It's November 20, 1862. This is a collection of letters. Dear parents, I had no letters the past week, but looked for one this afternoon. Things go on rather quiet most of the time. Our log shanties are all finished, and I am now with the boys. I'll tell you, I'm keeping a diary, and I will give you a copy of it for a week in this letter. And he goes on to describe a nice Indian summer day, November 11th. November 12th, I found some papers at the hotel called The Dakota Friend that I had been reading. They were left by a woman who had been stopping. This paper was a missionary paper for the Indians and had letters in it from Bishop Whipple. He is certainly a good man. I read some of his letters about the honesty of the Indians when the white man was honest with them. It made me think of good old One Eye and his band that came so many times to our place. I spoke of Bishop Whipple to the trappers and what he said of their honesty. But they said Whipple was an old man in breeches. November 13th. In this miserable Indian war, I often wonder what has become of Lightfoot. Father gave him that name because he could beat me in a race, and of his brothers, and of Owena. They promised to come back in the fall of 1860 when they broke camp the spring before, 2 miles below us, but they never came. I haven't lived long, but long enough to think this is a strange world. When I think of the Indians and remember how good they were to me and my father and mother, and reading in this Dakota Friend paper how the traders have made them drunk in order to cheat them, and how the government bought 35 million acres of them and has been owing them for it against their promise for 30 years. And because they were starving and broke into a warehouse for food, and this brought on a war. I am for the Indians as much as the whites. Your boy, Chauncey. It goes on like this, an amazingly perceptive young man on frontier Wisconsin. I had to actually cut back. I wanted to include so much of his voice that I was unable to. Let me do a time check, 7:42. Okay, let's do just two more. I'll mention just briefly this. I won't read from this section, but Richmond Center, from Richmond Center's wonderful accounts of the early suffragists who focused on Richmond Center. Richmond Center was a hotbed of suffragist activism in the late 1800s and into the early 20th century, leading up to the passage of the adoption of the 19th Amendment. So there's a whole story and reading in the book about the women activists of early Richmond Center. And on the right, on the left there, you see, in fact, another image from the book. The very first speech on women's rights was given by Lucy Stone in 1856 in Viroqua. Here is, of course, a person everyone recognizes. Frank Lloyd Wright put his mark on the Driftless, and out of the Driftless put his mark on the world through his work. We love, Keith and I both, when we first saw this image, we said, that's the one we want. Why? Because the building is so inconspicuous. That's Taliesin on the horizon in the background. But the image by his loyal photographer, Pedro Guerrero, is of the landscape, not of the building per se. And this was not unusual. This was, in fact, Frank Lloyd Wright's own way of understanding the importance of landscape in his work. So this is from Frank Lloyd Wright's autobiography in 1943, just a couple paragraphs, to speak to not just his way of building, but of understanding the built environment in the landscape, and in particularly in the driftless landscape. So the hill on which Taliesin now stands, the name Taliesin comes from the Welsh word means shining brow. The hill on which Taliesin now stands as its brow was one of my favorite places when, as a boy, looking for past flowers, I went there in March sun, while snow still streaked the hillsides. When you were on the low hill crown, you were out in midair as though swinging in a plane, the valley and two others dropping away from you, leaving the treetops standing below all about you. As a boy, I had learned to know the ground plan of the region in every line and feature. For me, now its elevation is the modeling of the hills, the weaving and the fabric that clings to them, the look of it all in tender green or covered with snow or in full glow of summer that burst into the glorious blaze of autumn. I still feel myself as much a part of it as the trees and birds and bees are, and the red barns, or as the animals are, for that matter. It was unthinkable to me, at least unbearable, that any house should be put on that beloved hill. I knew well that no house should ever be on a hill or on anything. It should be of the hill, belonging to it. Hill and house should live together, each the happier for the other. That was the way everything found roundabout was naturally managed, except when man did something. When he added his might, he became imitative and ugly. Why? Was there no natural house? I felt I had proved there was. Now I wanted a natural house to live in myself. I wished to be part of my beloved southern Wisconsin too. I did not want to put my small part of it out of countenance. Architecture, after all I have learned, or before all I should say, is no less a weaving and a fabric than the trees are. The world had had appropriate buildings before. Why not appropriate buildings now more so than ever? There must be some kind of house that would belong to that hill, as trees and the ledges of rock did, as grandmother and mother had belonged to it in their sense of it all. That passage goes on, and it goes on to describe the agricultural vision that Frank Lloyd Wright had for his Taliesin home. So again, some of these voices are very well known in our region and beyond, others of them less so. And so the wonderful thing about collecting them all together is they bounce off of each other. And as one reads through this collection, you have the same experience that Keith Keeley and I had putting it together, and that is seeing threads weaving or making connections, and seeing the continuity across time and across the Driftless area. So I'll finish up, and hopefully if you have some questions, we can chat a little bit, with a last poem by a woman named Kathy Davis. there's a poignant story to this, in that when I first read this poem, I reached out to her. She's living over in the Kickapoo Valley near Reedstown. And in fact, her whole poem is about Reedstown. And when I first read it, I reached out to her by email or made a phone call, and then I said, "We'd like to use your poem. Is that okay?" She said, "Yeah, I'd be honored." I never had a chance to meet Kathy. She actually passed away literally the day the book was being published. So I was unable to connect with her directly, and I made a point of reading this poem often as almost a way of honoring her and all those voices in the Driftless Reader. So this is her poem called Things I Love About Where I Am, from 2012. She had a career teaching at Kent State University in Ohio, and returned and retired to the Driftless. And as I read this, you can think about things you love about where you are in Blue Mountains. Things I love about where I am. Township of Kickapoo, Wisconsin, on the Kickapoo River, in the Okootch Mountains, in the county formerly known as Bad Axe. The goat at the bottom of the hill. The ruined farmhouse with a mini Stonehenge in front and solar panels in back. The sudden willow at the T intersection, manifesting voluminous and perfect as on a Chinese porcelain, but yellow, yellow. The fake deer on the bluff who changes clothes for each holiday. The town I live in, population 395. Its library, corner Wisconsin Railroad, with its 83-year-old librarian, who not only shushes no one, but talks herself constantly and at the top of her voice. The post office, corner of 4th and Elmo, open Saturdays 8:45 to 9:30, where the mailman posts his photos, 8x10 glossies of the town white squirrel, close-ups of the tree nursery eagles feeding their young, details of the holiday-clad fake deer, the real deer path across the corner of my yard, 4 kinds of woodpeckers gobbling suet, wild turkeys in the snow, all the long-haired men. That just brings a smile to my face every time I read that poem. And I've gathered, again, I never met Kathy, but everyone who did speak to me of her said that was her. She loved to laugh and had a great wit. And by the way, I just was going through Reedstown a couple of weeks ago. That fake deer is still on the little rock outcrop when you cross over the Kickapoo River right there in Reedstown. So thank you so much again for bearing with me. I hope you enjoyed hearing a little bit of reading, and I'll switch off the screen, and if we have time, we're at 7:50, we have time maybe to have a few comments or questions if you have any.
Sure, thanks so much, Curt, for sharing your background of the reader too. It was delightful to hear your own journey as you explored everyone else's in their visions and interpretations of the Driftless. So thank you for that. No questions have come in, but where would someone want to, where can we find your book? I mean, I honestly, so I'm going to be first to admit and ashamed to, but I don't have your book. And if anything, your presentation has actually really motivated me to go find it. So I'm wondering too, where can we find your book?
Well, I'm glad you asked for many reasons, but because you reminded me to mention something. The history of the book after it was published was the first printing sold out like almost overnight. It's crazy. We all knew we had a kind of a good idea for a book, but I think the University of Wisconsin Press was a little taken aback actually, so they quickly did a second printing back in 2017. But just in the last week, the UW Press and I've been in communication, they're going to do a third printing. It's actually pretty hard to find right now because the second printing is almost gone out now too. However, if you are looking for a copy, you might be able to find a copy at Arcadia Books in Spring Green. My pals down there, they're really great supporters of this project for obvious reasons. So you can check out, you can call up Arcadia and put in, or in fact, I'm going to recommend doing that, supporting our local independent bookstores. So if you're in the area, call up Arcadia Books and tell them you'd like to put in an order, and tell them Curt says there's a reprinting on the way. It should be available within a month or two. I'm sure there's some online. I'm told that online they go for $100. That's because, so just wait a little bit and you'll be able to get a copy.
Wonderful. No other questions coming in. Is anyone, I'm going to open it up to the floor then if you want to unmute yourself at all and ask Curt a question. Otherwise, we may just wrap up early.
Well, I see several comments here, and for those of you who have maybe already have the book, thank you so much. I mean, it's really been a fun project. Of all the books I've worked on, this was just, usually when you're working on a book, by the time you're all done with it, you're like, you're tired and you're drained out. But this was like joy from beginning to end, and it remains a lot of fun. So,
Curt,
yeah.
Tim and Linda Isley, we really enjoyed the book.
Hi, Tim.
From all of your research, looking through all the articles on the Driftless region, did you learn anything about some of the problems that we're facing now in the Driftless region? Any thoughts on that? Some of the things that are coming up and what we're going to be facing in the future? It's such a gorgeous area.
Great question, Tim, and it's good to hear your voice. Absolutely. In fact, in the process of pulling the book together, remembering a comment from one of the early reviewers when it was still in manuscript, and made the point of saying, don't paint an idyllic picture. There's a lot of pain and loss and destruction associated with our landscape. And he was exactly right. And we'd already anticipated that and already begun to include some key selections. Boy, there's several pieces within the book that really speak to that. And there's a song. We have several songs in the book. One was called Frack Sand Song. Put yourself back in 2016 when we were working on the book. It was the height of the frack sand boom. And it seemed there was never going to be an end to it. And it was just going like a juggernaut across the landscape. And so the song that was written by a Minnesota songwriter about the frack sand process, the mining of frack sand, we included. There's a poem in the book called Driftless Elegy by a very accomplished poet who grew up in Fountain City on the Mississippi River.
His return? I think so.
And that poem is gut-wrenching. It's all about the decline of small towns in not just obviously the Driftless, but in so much of rural America, where industrial agriculture has depleted our culture, our landscapes, our economies, our local economies. And he captures it in that poem so poignantly. So yeah, Tim, to your point, whether it's climate change and flooding, frack sand mining, loss of small town economic sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. These are part of the story, and this is the current story. So part of the rationale for doing the book, in fact, I would say both Keith and I were thinking about, if we are going to achieve the next generation of sustainable ways of being on the land, we have to absorb these stories from the past. And that includes recognizing, in particular, the historic role of the Ho-Chunk Nation. And some of you know me and know that I've been working on that for many, many years in association with the old Badger Army ammunition plant up here in Sauk County. So, the book is of a piece with the conservation issues that we all are aware of. Carla, good to see your name on the screen. Yes.
Kurt, we're sitting here, Mary and I are sitting here, and Mary is also an author. And so we've got your book right in front of us. And it was great to be able to read along with some of the readings that you did. And Mary was so appreciative of understanding how the reader came about and how to really enjoy it as just sort of a, how did you say it, Mary?
How to enjoy a book that starts in a man's mind and eventually arrives on paper, delivered to an appreciative audience.
You're making my day. There's a pretty funny story on that. This idea had been floating in my head one day. And I have a friend who used to be one of the editors at the University of Wisconsin Press. Some of you know Andrea Christofferson. And I saw Andrea one day and we met. I was passing off something to her. It was at my friend's a place in Lodi. And I said, Andrea, I have a book you're going to do. Now, that's pretty darn cheeky. I'm not the type of person who would say something like that, but there was a gut feeling that a book like this was just so ripe. It was so ripe and ready to happen. So I said, Andrea, you're going to do this book, and University of Wisconsin Press should do it because it's about the Driftless. And sure enough, 2 years later, whatever, it came into being. But I want to quickly make another point, though, that it's not unique to the Driftless that you can do a collection like this. And in fact, every place, no matter where we are or find ourselves, not only its stories can be told in this way, but they need to be. Every place deserves its own reader. The Driftless Area lends itself in so many ways to this type of treatment, but there should be a Lake Superior reader. There should be a Milwaukee reader. There should be a name your landscape. There should be readers for all our places. And so I hope I've always hoped it would provide a model. Oh, the impact of the ATC power line. I see that comment. Oh boy, yes, indeed. In fact, one of the consequences of doing the Driftless Reader was that I was called upon to be an expert witness in the original case to try to affect the fate of the ATC proposal. So I ended up being literally an expert on the Driftless Area. And I was on the witness stand literally in Madison. And this was asking, do you consider yourself an expert on the Driftless Area? And I said, well, I published a book on it and I've learned a lot. So I've been keeping up with that, and I know it's been in the news just recently too. So we have a lot of work to do in caretaking. And thanks again for all your efforts down there.
Your conversation is making me think, Kurt. I actually have I always thought of it as a great embodiment between like the cultural and the landscape. And I like to think of it as like the master's thesis or research study I would have done if I didn't do prairies. And I have favorite silos. And the silos, I'm wondering if you ever encountered them in your research through all these different readings. It's those baked clay, I think. I'm not sure exactly what kind they are. They're they're beautiful. They almost look like an enameled brick. And you can see them spread. I want to say it's up through the Driftless, down like it's kind of north. It's kind of stretched this line, almost following the tension zone, I feel like, down from La Crosse into Madison and out east. I'm just wondering if you ever encountered any writings about those. They might be more recent, like in the 1930s. But I also appreciated them and wondering if like a silo or what other kind of physical imagery on the landscape you've encountered as you thought of this book that also maybe should be protected for posterity, representing those cultural environmental connections.
That's funny. I actually have one of those old ceramic silos about 50 yards to the west of where I'm sitting right here. My landlord is very devoted to historic preservation and has kept up that. Or another example is that poem about Makaya Revels in the Cheyenne Valley. He and neighbors and colleagues were very well known actually for being the premier builders of round barns. And so you can go up to the Cheyenne Valley area and still see a number of extant round barns built, boy, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, I'm guessing. There's a whole district of them around there that people have been working to preserve up there. So yeah, this cultural landscape gets expressed. And for some reason, think of Mineral Point. Think of the efforts to do the historic preservation in Mineral Point. On and on. This landscape just seems to evoke this desire to stay connected and to keep it vital. Yeah. You're reminding me, I'm going to share after we're done here, Mike, I'll share with you a link because just yesterday, a young student in Madison, a PhD student in geology, his name is Rudy Molinek. Rudy has his own podcast called Under Our Feet. And I'm going to recommend this strongly to you. He's studying geology, and he's done a wonderful job of telling it through 9 episodes of the geology of Wisconsin. And this is the end of season 1. He just literally posted this yesterday. And his last episode featured, he came out to visit me and he interviewed me, and he also interviewed Eric Carson, a wonderful colleague who is with the State Geological and Natural History Survey and one of the premier geologists in Wisconsin and knows the driftless backward and forward. So he did his last program about the driftless. So I'll recommend it as a follow-up too, and I can send you the link to that if you can't find it. But just look up Under Our Feet podcast, and you'll find the links to these programs. So I'm trying to help them out and share that with people.
Great.
Hey, Curt, it's Mike Samuel.
Hey, Mike.
Hope you're doing well.
Yes, it's great to see your name on the screen.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you from those of us who live in the Driftless for making all the information about the history and the social aspects and the ecology and so much more so easily accessible, so that we can actually appreciate the uniqueness of the area we live in. It's a wonderful resource.
Well, I really appreciate that, Mike. When I moved into the Driftless proper, I was living on the edge kind of in Sauk Prairie, and then I moved out to where I am now. And I think the magic started just working on me. I think those of us who are blessed to be in this part of the world, it works on us, and that's what happens in any place if you're attuned to it. And it inspires us in ways we can sometimes understand consciously, but it's also what goes on unconsciously. But you hit in your comment on a real key point, that the caretaking of the place requires that we understand all of its histories and all of its stories and all of its layers. And so for me, it was completely an enriching project to work on, and it continues to be. So thanks, Mike. I really appreciate that. Thanks for all that you've done over the many, many years that you and I've known each other.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Curt. Oh, Chris, go ahead. Sorry.
Curt, this is Chris Euclid. Good to see you.
Yes. Hi, Chris.
So you touched on this briefly, but I also wanted to thank you for the amount of time you spent in the book talking about our Native American heritage in the Driftless area. And especially, I think it's one that we really need to appreciate, because when we talk about mounds, we think of blue mounds, but there actually were many, many, many Indian mounds in this area. And most of them, as you know, have disappeared. There still are some that haven't been plowed over, but it's a part of our history that I think we also really need to recognize and learn more about. So thank you.
You had to explain in the book the difference between the geologic mounds and the cultural effigy mounds, just to make sure that language was clarified for readers, especially those not familiar with them. But yeah, I could say a great deal about this. That I did mention before that my own work over the years and with the Ho-Chunk Nation, regularly for 25 years in the transformation of the Badger Army ammunition plant, but it's also the story of the Kickapoo Valley and the partnership up there between the state DNR and the nation. And since even the Driftless Reader came out, of course, there's been just unprecedented amount of interest in desire to understand this history and to try to find ways forward. And I can tell you that the other conservation organizations, and I'm sure you have in your own experience, are working on this, and it's put a lot of time and effort on our friends in the Ho-Chunk Nation, because there is a lot of interest in trying to do this the right way. But I have no doubt the Blue Mounds Group, as you go forward, will hopefully have opportunities to talk about consultation with the nation. And so that work almost every day, there's some new opportunity or desire or need that expresses itself. So I really appreciate that. We did do our best. And one of my fondest memories, again, of the process of working on the book was meeting with the then president of the nation and having a meal and just talking about what we were up to and making sure. And there were a number of other members, in this case of the Ho-Chunk Nation, that I reached out to for permissions, for recommendations, and so forth. So we have a lot of work to do, and I hope the book contributes to that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Curt, for sharing your stories and everyone else's stories as well, on behalf of the Blue Mounds Area Project. And for those of you who aren't members or don't know the Blue Mounds Area Project, we are a small member-driven and directed nonprofit here, centered out of Mount Horeb and the 4-county area surrounding Blue Mounds. And we support private landowners on their own journeys in restoration and habitat protection, and the necessity of preserving that landscape into the future, so we can continue to have a future Driftless Reader for ourselves as well. So
you're right in the next chapters, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So check us out, consider joining. One of those perks is having me. I'm the Blue Mounds Area Project Outreach Ecologist, and you can have me out to your property to talk through habitat, and I'll do my best to talk about culture as well, if that's your interest. So check us out. We're at bluemounds.org, and look forward to seeing many of you in our summer events. And so I would say stay tuned to our website. We also present updates and new opportunities and new information through our e-bulletin, as well as our hard copy newsletter, well regarded over the last, I think we're maybe 26 years old. No, more than that. We were in 1996. So I'm a little late for me to do the math, but check us out, consider supporting. Thank you so much again, Curt, and wish everyone a good night.
Thank you all.